Thank you so much, Chris. I was really glad to come up here and support my good friend. We've known each other for a long time, and he worked at Antietam, he got that on his career, which is a good thing. We're going to look at Antietam and talk a little bit about how it is different from Gettysburg, but there's a lot of similarities too. I can tell you one thing that's different. When I left the parking lot this morning at 11 o'clock, we had like 3 cars there. This is incredible. If I had a program, we'd have 2 people, so I'm really pleased to see so, at least this time of year. Obviously, you know it's a tough time of year. I'm not going to talk much about the battle. We're going to look at the history of the park. I'm personally fascinated by the history of the park itself and how it's basically come to be what it is today. Every park has a different story, and I just think that's really interesting, and there's similarities and differences between us and Gettysburg, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today too. Going to have a little bit of presidents in there too, since it is President's Day weekend, but we're going to start off with the battle and then move into the first part of the preservation of Antietam Battlefield Park. From sunrise to sunset, the waves of battle ebbed and flowed. Men wrestled with each other in lines of regiments, brigades, and divisions. Regiments, brigades, and divisions faded away under the terrible fire, leaving long lines of dead to mark where stood the living. Fields of corn were trampled into shreds. Forests were battered and scathed. Huge limbs sent crashing to the earth, rent by shell or round shot. Grape and canister mingled their hissing scream in the hellish carnival. That's Brigadier General George Gordon, who described Antietam as a hellish carnival. And then, of course, we have the aftermath. Here's a letter from a soldier in the 2nd Rhode Island, 3 days after the battle. The most appalling part of the horrid scene were the dead and mutilated human forms that lay by the thousands on the gory field. Individuals were scattered for miles over the fields and through the woods. They lay in long rows where their lines of battle were. They were piled in heaps in the deep and narrow roads and behind stone walls. They were in groups here and there from 3 to 60, and in all conceivable circumstances of repulsiveness and horror. 2 days after the battle, the burial crews moved in. Captain Joseph Fayville, 57th New York. The men were in every state of mutilation, sans arms, legs, heads, in greater number than on any field we had seen before. We dug ditches wide enough to hold the 2 bodies, feet together, head out. How many shattered hopes we buried there, none of us will ever guess. War is a cruelty, a dreadful thing, an ugly blot on civilization. These are the burial crews working at the sunken road, or what became known as Bloody Lane. That's the sunken road there. If you visit the park today, the tower would be right there, and these are mass graves that were located out in front, primarily Confederate. Burials along the stone wall at the lower or Burnside Bridge. They tore the planks off the bridge to mark the dead. This actually was taking place just out behind where the visitor center sits today. Just a few weeks after the battle, we had our first presidential visit. Abraham Lincoln came to Antietam. He spent 4 days there, the first 4 days in October. He met with General McClellan, toured the battlefield. There's Union Commander General McClellan. There's Fitzjohn Porter, 5th Corps. Some of y'all might recognize this fella kind of standing off to the side. Spend a little time here, maybe. That image was taken just on the west side of Sharpsburg. The first land preserved at what became Antietam National Battlefield was the National Cemetery, and it was created out of necessity. 4,000 bodies were buried across the battlefield, on farmers' fields, in backyards. 4,000 graves across these farmers' fields. So in the next spring, when they wanted to plant, how do you plant your field? And if you're going to have graves buried and you're a soldier and you've been out there for 3 or 4 days trying to put 4,000 bodies in, are you going to go to the rocky field or the soft, freshly plowed field? You don't care about the people that live in Sharpsburg. You want the bodies in the ground. So everybody that lived there, their farms, their fields are filled with graves. And it was a bottom-up movement. It was the citizens of Sharpsburg that began the legislation, began writing to their congressmen to try to solve this problem. It started as Maryland state legislature, then it moved up to the national to create our cemetery. It took 5 years to get that done. 11 acres were purchased for $1,161. 11 acres, which became the National Cemetery. All of that work was done in 1865, early 1866. The war had just ended. We've come through this Holocaust. There is tremendous bitterness. Plus, the cemetery was paid for by the states. The amount that you were to contribute was based on how many soldiers you had to bury. Obviously, the former Confederacy was devastated. They didn't have any money to contribute. You add to that the bitterness. Union only were moved, reinterred, and buried at the National Cemetery. Union only. Eventually, 4,776 Union soldiers from the Battle of Antietam and all the surrounding battles, all brought to the cemetery. Confederates eventually, 10 years after the battle, were reinterred to 3 local cemeteries. But I start with this because this is the genesis of Antietam National Battlefield, the first land preserved, 11 acres for the National Cemetery, dedicated on the 5th anniversary in 1867. We had our second presidential visit. Andrew Johnson came to dedicate the cemetery. He looked out to the crowd, which was a very large crowd. When we look on yon battlefield, I think of the brave men who fell in the fierce struggle of battle, who sleep silent in their graves. Yes, many of them sleep in silence and peace within this beautiful enclosure after the earnest conflict has ceased. I know most of you have probably been to the park. What was not there was the huge statue in the center of the National Cemetery. That would come later. What is known as the Private Soldier Monument. The Private Soldier Monument. 250 tons, 27 pieces, carved in Rhode Island, Westerly, Rhode Island. This is one of my favorite images. Just found this one recently. That's General Tom Thumb, the shortest general with the tallest soldier in the country. Crazy thing is, it didn't make it to the battlefield for a little while because they took it to Philadelphia for the Centennial Exposition. 1876, they took 250 tons of Civil War statue to Philadelphia, had it out in front of the main entrance and building. To give you a size of scale, you can see those give you the scale of that soldier. I would argue, as far as the soldier goes, it's one of the largest soldiers anywhere in the country for Civil War monuments. They brought him back to Washington, D.C., and we're going to bring him up the C&O Canal to the park. The top half of the soldier fell off into the Potomac River, so that delayed him another couple of months while they tried to fish him out of the river. Then they brought him up the C&O Canal to Sharpsburg, which is on the other side of town. What I do not have a photograph. Anybody of you out there, if you have this photograph up in your attic, please share it with me. What I've never seen is a photograph of them dragging the pieces through town on gigantic logs and rollers with 20 mules, 20 mule teams coming through Sharpsburg. I'd like to have a photograph of that. The Private Soldier Monument was dedicated in 1880. Another one of my favorite images. Beautiful. It stands 44 feet 7 inches tall. The soldier stands in place rest, facing homeward to the north. Cost $32,000, 1867 or 1880s when it dedicated. Beautiful view of the cemetery. So that's our first land, and just a little piece of current news. Originally there was a walkway, a carriage path. We just got funding. That's going to go back in 2017. And we're going to replant this tree line and make it a much more formal cemetery. So we're excited about that. Just got the money here this week. The cemetery is where you came to remember and to gather and remember the battle. And we started off, of course, with Decoration Day, which changed to Memorial Day. And that is where you visited the park. Basically, the first visitor center was the Lodge building at the National Cemetery. And that's all there was for a national park, a national battlefield, was the cemetery for many years until 1890. Of course, the veterans started to come back and have reunions. I've got a lot of photographs from some of their reunions and monument dedications. The veterans started to gather. Time had passed. Some of the healing had gone on where they could come back, even Union and Confederate soldiers shaking hands on the battlefield many years later. Some of the pain had gone away. The first 2 monuments built at Antietam, both of them in the National Cemetery, because remember, that's the only land preserved. So the first 2 monuments, both New York monuments, built inside the cemetery. And what I have a lot of images you'll see here is for almost every one of these monument dedications or reunions, they would issue these beautiful ribbons that they would give to the soldiers. So I got a few samples of those. I just think those are great. 1888, the 125th Pennsylvania gathered behind the Dunker Church. That's probably the most beautiful ribbon in our collection, the 130th Pennsylvania. They're standing out behind the roulette house, if you've been to the battlefield. Each one of the men, you can see they're wearing that ribbon. Beautiful. This is the first monument that was built on the battlefield proper, and it makes sense that it's a Maryland monument. Company A&I, the 5th Maryland. That's actually just north of the Sunken Road or Bloody Lane. So that's the first monument built on the field proper, 1890. You have two things that are going to be going on in the 1890s. You're going to have all of the veterans that are coming to join, and very similar here, I know. You have all of the veterans that are coming and visiting the park, and the same thing that's happening is the United States military is trying to professionalize, trying to educate their officers and their men. Of course, the Army War College is going to be part of that. This is the earliest image I have of the Army War College coming to Sharpsburg to tour the battlefield. It's 1906. So we're really talking about the 1890 period, but that's the earliest image I have. The United States Army War College that year did a 600-mile horseback ride to every battlefield in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Yeah. When I went to school there, we took a bus ride to New York. I didn't get to do all the battlefields, so that's the earliest image I have. But the point I want to make here is you have these two converging movements, if you will. The veterans and the United States military coming to the parks to remember and to learn. And that's what it leads to, the creation of the first 5 national military parks. That's what came out of that movement. The United States military wanted to have a place, a formal place that was preserved where they could train. And they wanted to commemorate the service of the major armies and the major campaigns. Chickamauga was first and is still the largest. My friends that work there are quick to tell me that. Gettysburg, 1890, Antietam. But what we're going to talk about is Antietam did not become a full-fledged national military park. All of these were created by the United States War Department, but it did not become a full-fledged national military park. And the one reason I can tell you is we didn't have a Dan Sickles. You know, we didn't have this people in Congress that were pushing this movement, a champion, if you will, of the battlefield. But what I always tell people is that the National Park Service didn't create Antietam Battlefield or these other 4. The United States War Department did. Here's the legislation that created the park. Act of Congress, 30 August 1890. Authorized $15,000, quote, for the purpose of surveying, locating, and preserving the lines of battle of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. And for preserving the lines of battle, and all lands acquired by the United States for this purpose, whether by purchase, gift, or otherwise, shall be under the care and supervision of the Secretary of War. Not the Secretary of Interior, our boss, the Secretary of War. Now, before we get into some more Antietam specific, this was not always appreciated in some circles, creating these national military parks. Come back to my friends here at Gettysburg. It was a little bit controversial when they started buying all the land here. There was a little item called the Gettysburg Electric Railway. Y'all are familiar with that. Wanted to build it right through the middle of the park. And for the first time, condemnation was used to take that land from the Gettysburg Electric Railway. They sued, of course. Went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So there is going to be a test in the United States Supreme Court where the United States government can preserve battlefield land. Here's the decision. I'll share that with you. 1896. The importance of the issue involved in the contest of which this great battle was part cannot be overestimated. The existence of the government itself, and the perpetuity of our institutions depended on the result. The Supreme Court is saying that the government itself was at stake with this American Civil War, which is true. Can it be that the government is without power to preserve this land and properly mark out the various sites upon which the struggle took place? Can it not erect monuments provided for these acts of Congress, or even take possession of the field of battle in the name of and for the benefit of all the citizens of the country, for the present and for the future. Such a use seems necessary not only as a public use, but one so closely connected with the welfare of the Republic itself, as to be within the powers granted by Congress in the Constitution for the purpose of protecting and preserving the country. The welfare of our nation, the health of our nation, depended on preserving these hallowed grounds. United States Supreme Court, 1896. Well, at Antietam, just like at Gettysburg, they created what was called the Antietam Battlefield Board, or a battlefield board. And this was the leader of the battlefield board at Antietam, Ezra Carman, the greatest historian at Antietam. He wrote the history, and remember in the legislation it said to mark the lines of battle. That's how they did it with the War Department tablets. That's how they marked the lines of battle. Soldiers needed to see the battlefield, so they built the tower. I like that image for those of you who've been there. You notice there's no roof when they first built it. That came about 5 years later. Ezra Carman basically created Antietam National Battlefield through his research and his team, and they created some things that were just absolutely still with us today, critical to your visit. They created the road network. The road network at the park today is basically the exact same one that was there in 1890. Changed a little bit with the bypass and some other things we'll talk about, but basically the same road network. And this is absolutely critical. They created 14 historic maps of the landscape and the action. This is the document. Oops, I'm still getting used to this clicker here. That map is the document that we use to preserve the battlefield because it was all still there. Most of the folks were there. What they did was they sent letters, form letters and maps to every veteran they could find. Who was on your right? Who was on your left? What time did you go in? What time did you come out? What was this field? Where was this fence? And they created this incredibly detailed map which has the types of fencing, what was in the field, the orchards, the battle lines. And this is the document that we use to preserve your battlefield today. This is really the Bible of the landscape, and it is all about the landscape. So once the battlefield was created in 1890, there was an explosion in the 1890s to 1910 of these reunions, monuments, and dedications. Philadelphia Brigade Park, 1896, they issued ribbons and pins. At the dedication, their regimental commander spoke, Captain Riley. What a terrible slaughter was this day of battle. The valor displayed on this field by the men of the North and the South had never been equaled by the armies of other nations. Here we met foes worthy of steel. They were Americans, brothers in whose veins flowed the same ancestors, though for a time estranged. Thank God that we can meet today, comrades of a united country, under one Constitution and one flag. This is the Massachusetts State Monument. The governor came out, Governor Wolcott. He looked out to the veterans that were there and the families. You offered your lives to the country in the day of her peril, and a united country which holds no slave is your fitting monument. A united country which holds no slave is your monument. In dedicating this monument, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts proudly recalls the part which your sons bore in the great battle which has made this field forever memorable. May this granite monument symbolize her gratitude and the permanence of her fame. What the issue of the day wrought will, however, outlast granite and bronze. The preservation of the nation will outlive that granite and bronze. This is the Maryland State Monument, one of the most unique monuments on the battlefield, mainly because it is the only one that was dedicated to both sides. We had units in both the Union and the Confederate Army. One of the largest events that ever took place. They issued medals and ribbons. And we had another presidential visit, a veteran of Antietam, William McKinley. 20,000 people came out for the dedication on Memorial Day, 1900. General Longstreet, Henry Kidd Douglas, many veterans. President McKinley, as you know, has a monument himself at the battlefield. He was the keynote speaker. He looked out to the crowd, and here's what he said. I am glad to meet on this field the followers of Lee, Jackson, Longstreet, and Johnson, with the followers of McClellan, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, greeting each other not with arms at their hands, but with affection in every heart. This meeting, after these many years, has but one sentiment: love for nation and love for flag. you can see the years had healed these men's wounds. And it was all about loving the nation from this Holocaust that we had been through. Sadly, 14 months later, President McKinley is assassinated. Here's the 15th Massachusetts, another one of the park favorites, the Wounded Lion. The 15th Massachusetts had the highest number of casualties for any regiment that fought at Antietam. They went into battle with 606 soldiers, 318 were killed and wounded. Highest number for any regiment in the Union Army. It was dedicated by the commander, John Kimball. He looked out to the crowd. "This monument is not erected to commemorate the bitter conflict, but to express and publicly testify our admiration for the devotion to duty and the great cause of freedom that led these brave men to offer their lives to save the Union from dissolution." This is the 34th New York, back behind the Dunker Church. Major Spanagle, the 34th, looked and said, "There are no better teachers for those who come after us than the silent monuments on the battlefields, marking the places where men died for a principle they believed right, whether they wore the blue or the gray." We have 96 monuments in Antietam. How many here, John? I don't even know. It's ridiculous. Yeah. We have 96 monuments at Antietam. This is the New Jersey monument. Another presidential visit. Teddy Roosevelt came out, 1903. Nice crowd. He looked out. Here's what he said. "On behalf of the nation, I accept this gift. We meet today on one of the great battlefields of the Civil War. No other battle of the war lasting but one day shows as great a percentage of loss as that which occurred here. Moreover, in its ultimate effects, this battle was of momentous and even decisive importance. For when it had ended and Lee had retreated south of the Potomac, Lincoln forthwith published that immortal paper, the preliminary document of emancipation. The paper which declared that the Civil War, besides being a war for the preservation of the Union, should be a war for the emancipation of the slave. So from that time onward, the causes of union and of freedom, of national greatness and individual liberty were one and the same." And like most of these monuments, and I know what happens here, people drive by, they have no idea that these monuments, all of the symbolism that goes into them, there was a great deal of expense and a lot of thought that went into these monuments. And for us, that New Jersey monument is one of them. There's a soldier up top. You've seen this across the country at Civil War battlefields. But that's a real person. And I know one of the monuments here, it's a real person. That's Captain Hugh Irish, the 13th New Jersey. That's who that soldier represents. Hugh Irish was killed within 20 feet of where that monument was. He was leading his men across the Hagerstown Turnpike. He was 30 years old, had a wife and 2 children at home. He raised a company, basically sold his business. Betsy, his wife, was just terrified when he was getting ready to march off to war. So she said to Hugh, she asked him, "What will I do if you would never come back?" Here's what he responded. "It would be better for the boys to be without a father than be without a government under which to live." Our government was more important than the lives of this soldier. That's what he felt, and that's why he marched to Sharpsburg. For my good friends in Pennsylvania, we had Pennsylvania Day at Antietam, 1904. The best name I got in my program today, that's Governor Pennypacker. 1904. They dedicated 13 Pennsylvania monuments that day. There are more Pennsylvania monuments to Sharpsburg than any other. Close by, mainly the monuments that were not put here is why they ended up coming down to Sharpsburg. That's 125th Pennsylvania. Once again, what means something to me is, these are not just granite and a stone. That's a real person up there. That monument represents Sergeant George Simpson. He was the color bearer. In the battle, of course, he's right in front, as the color bearers were. He's leading the charge into the West Woods. He's shot in the head, killed instantly. The next soldier picks it up. He's shot. Every soldier is diving onto this flag to save it. The greatest dishonor would be to lose your colors. So he's killed instantly. He's buried initially on the battlefield. Later, he's moved to the National Cemetery. That's where he lies today, in our National Cemetery. All the veterans came back in 1904, 40 years later. The monument was unveiled by George's sister, Miss Annie Simpson. Here's the part I like the best. They brought back the original flag that he gave his life for. It's in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Just a great image. 51st Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania Reserve Day. Got to have that because there were Pennsylvania Reserve units there. 4 of those up on the north end of the battlefield, 1906. Here's the 20th New York. They actually have 2 monuments. They had the one, I showed you, the first 2 monuments that were built in the National Cemetery. They actually have 2 monuments. They had one in the National Cemetery. Then they came back and dedicated one. This monument's just right outside of the Visitor Center. The 20th New York, commanded by Colonel Ernst Matthias Peter von Wegesack. They had almost all German soldiers, brand new immigrants. I don't know how these guys all talk to each other. They actually carried 3 flags onto the battlefield. They were formed out of the United Turner Society, if anybody's heard of that, kind of a patriotic group that brought from Germany. But what I do like, when they built that monument there to stand forever of granite, they put the U.S. flag on top, the reason they were there. This is the New York State Monument, probably the largest monument on the battlefield. Of course, New York, they got to build the biggest one. 1920, they issued these medals for the veterans or the guests. Right here, the keynote speaker was Nelson Miles. Yeah. He was awarded the Medal of Honor at Chancellorsville. He fought at Antietam. He took over the regiments. He rose to be the commander-in-chief during the Spanish-American War. Interesting, they bought the plot of land, so that's what was going on. There was no national park there yet. All there was really a cemetery. So what was happening is these states and regiments were buying these little pieces of land to put their monuments on. Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia bought about 10 acres. New York bought about 10 acres. Actually 7 acres for $1,402. What's interesting is the monument cost $29,000. In other words, the monument was 20 times the cost of the land. It was dedicated in 1920, and 250 veterans made it back. Yeah, 58 years later. Here's what Nelson Miles, who dedicated his entire life in the service of his country, here's what he said. Since the creation, there has never existed in this world a people who enjoyed more freedom, liberty of thought and action, security of life and property, or as well provided for with all the requirements and comforts of life than the citizens of the United States. These bountiful blessings are derived from the government. Many nations have gone into decay and oblivion by the indifference and apathy of their citizens. Ours will be no exception, unless our people maintain and preserve it with a devoted loyalty. If the sublime patriotism manifested by you, he's looking at the veterans now, if the sublime patriotism manifested by you on this battlefield and in your lives since is maintained and perpetuated by the citizens of this country, then our republic will be forever safe, and we will ascend to an even higher and more exalted civilization and a purer destiny. So if we could just model our lives after these veterans, we will have a more perfect destiny. That's not a good image. That is the historic Dunker Church. The Dunker Church blew down in a windstorm in 1921. Luckily, a local farmer named Elmer Boyer bought the property, bought all that material, and put it in a barn. We'll pick that story up a little later. The largest event that's ever happened in the history of the park was in 1924, where the entire contingent of United States Marines marched up from Quantico. First thing they did was march to Frederick, Maryland for 3 days of liberty. I haven't read how that went. Then they came over to the park and had major movements. They had an encampment. They brought tanks. They brought aircraft out of Hagerstown Airport, Curtiss Biowings. 40,000 people came out to see the maneuvers. Probably the biggest events ever happened in the park. We're not going to do that again. We are not going to have tanks and aircraft coming to the park. However, we still do. I do about 30 military groups a year. A couple years ago, I had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The United States military still visits our parks and still visits our battlefields. That's a 25-year tradition. But we're not doing tanks and aircraft anymore. That day, they brought any Marines? Amen. Thank you for your service. You probably know these fellows here, or you ought to. That's General Lejeune. And the other fellow, the most decorated Marine, the greatest leatherneck of all time, Smedley Butler. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor twice. Look at that. they're going to make it a point to greet the veterans. So people continued to tour. I just love these images. The old cars going around, still using the same roads that we use today. Our first Confederate monument in 1936, the Daughters of the Confederacy, the Robert E. Lee monuments out on the west side of town. Another major event, the 75th anniversary, is my favorite. We're going, are you? Old veterans coming out. The United States Mint did a 50-cent piece with Lee and McClellan on it, United States coin, 50-cent piece. If you got one of those, let me know. I'll meet you afterwards out here. See what we work out. The program, huge event. There's FDR. You can see the number of people there. Not a very flattering image, but there's the park superintendent right there. He's got his back to the camera. Franklin Roosevelt looked out to the crowd. Here's what he said. It's classic Roosevelt. Believe me, you could just hear his words. In the presence of the spirits of those who fell on this field, Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers, we can believe that they rejoice with us in the unity of understanding which is so increasingly ours today. They urge us on in all we do to foster and unify in the spirit of tolerance, of willingness to help a neighbor, and faith in the destiny of the United States. Classic FDR, help out your neighbor. Remember, we're going into the Depression here. Huge crowd there for that event. Every national park in the system, there's 408 national parks, every single one has what is called the enabling legislation. The enabling legislation, that is the actual congressional legislation that creates the park. Now, Antietam Battlefield and the 5 original national battlefield parks were transferred to the National Park Service, Department of Interior in 1933. The United States government was basically consolidating all the lands into one agency. So we truly became a national park in 1933, but we did not have our enabling legislation until 1960. So 30 years later is when we actually got our enabling legislation. And there's 2 absolutely critical things here that I want you to pay attention to. The first is this one right here. We want to restore it to the condition at which it was at the time of the Battle of Antietam. That was basically our mission from the start, is to restore it to what it looked like at the time of the battle. But in 1960, not all the landowners really wanted us to be there, to say, so they also included this little piece right here. No more than 600 acres will ever be purchased. Because what happened as the battlefield parks were being created, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Shiloh, and Vicksburg, they started to buy all the land. Hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands and thousands, millions of dollars to buy all this land. Remember, as I told you, we had no great congressional champion for Antietam. So they did not buy any land at Sharpsburg, except for these tiny little pieces to build these monuments on. When they did the transfer in 1933, Antietam National Battlefield was 65 acres. 65 acres. That's it. And the leaders of the battlefield boards actually created what they called the Antietam Plan. And the Antietam Plan was, this is farmland in the middle of western Maryland. It's never going to change. The most appropriate use of these lands is agriculture, because it was agricultural in 1862. It is agriculture today. These farmers are the best caretakers of this land. We don't need to buy into this land. All we need to do is build a little road network to get around and see it. That's why it was 65 acres, the road network. That's it. Because the land was going to be there forever, and it was an agricultural use, which is what it was in 1862. Now we know what land values and land development in the 30s and 40s and even up to the 60s, it's a little different than what it is today. But the landowners were not interested in this huge federal facility being there, so as an appeasement to that, enabling legislation, 600 acres, no more. So that's what you end up with. That's Bloody Lane. Oh, I heard that over there. You remember the little snack shop down there? That's good. Yeah. My Ted Alexander, the park historian, just retired. He remembered going down there as a kid trying to talk his mom into buying a chicken salad sandwich that was sitting down there in the sun all day. She kept saying, no, you don't want that. It's sitting out in the sun all day. Ted just retired, if y'all don't know, in end of December. So if you don't buy the land, that's what you're going to have. You used to drive your car across the Burnside Bridge till 1964. That's how you visited the park. You'd come down here, park at the bridge. All the locals would come out, have picnics and carry on down there. So, you know, the land, everything's about the land. There's the Dunker Church, or the foundation. The foundation was still there. Love the beautiful trailer, the houses all around it. Another presidential visit. 1963, April 7th. President Kennedy's at Camp David, which is about halfway between the two parks here. There's Caroline. Gets on the helicopter, rides it, lands it down in a big field right near the Burnside Bridge. They pulled up this convertible Cadillac. That's the park historian, Mr. Lagerman. They took a tour of the battlefield. Here's the crazy thing. They just pull up to the cornfield and people are just all around him. Right? This is before November of... there they are, just kind of looking over the battlefield. That's by the New York Monument. Here's the crazy thing. They're down at Burnside Bridge, right? They got to wait for the traffic to clear so the president can go out on the bridge. Then they got back on the helicopter and flew back up to Camp David. There's Caroline and John Jr., Jackie. The kids weren't allowed to come on the trip, but those kids did come to the park. About 20 years ago, I did a tour for the Shelby Foote and I'll throw a name out there. Shelby Foote and I gave a tour to the entire Kennedy family about 20 years ago. Senator Ted Kennedy was the leader of the group. They brought Eunice, John Jr., Caroline. Of course, just being the normal park ranger thing, the first thing I did was ask Senator Kennedy, "Sir, you ever been here before?" He goes, "Yes, I was here with my brother. It was this visit. He came along on that trip." Of course, 6 months later, as we know, the president was assassinated. But Kennedy, before he was killed, he did write about Antietam. I want to share that with you. Antietam symbolizes something even more important than combat heroism and military strategy. It marks a diplomatic turning point of worldwide consequence. From this point onward, the Civil War had a new dimension, which was important to the whole course of human liberty. Oh, jumped over that one. 1962, the last reenactment held on National Battlefield parks. People got hurt. As you know, we don't do that anymore, but some great images there of of course, the quality of that movement is obviously much better today than it was in 1962. And they built the visitor center. The 60s were the glory days for Civil War parks because it was the centennial period, the 100th anniversary. You start having all these major events, and we built the visitor center. 1964, there's no theater yet, though. That's added in the 80s. And they rebuilt the Dunker Church. Just a little side point here is Elmer Boyer, the local farmer that has saved all the materials, they bought that from him, the Maryland Historical Society. What I like about this image is, you notice the bricks look different here than over here. What they did was they used all the original bricks at the doorway. And the idea there was when you walk through the entranceway, you're walking through the original material. And you're on the original foundation, a lot of original floor. Oh, I got from the rededication, I'll share that with you. This is the Maryland governor for the rededication. In a field shrouded with smoke, the church alone was the only visible landmark. And this Dunker Church stood out as a beacon by which the commanders took their direction and men found their way through the smoky chaos of battle. May it stand in peace as it did in war, as a beacon to guide those searching through their way through the darkness. May it stand throughout all ages as a symbol of mercy, peace, and understanding. The Clara Barton Monument, 1962. There's the chairman of the American Red Cross. Any park volunteers out there? This one's for you. He looked out to the crowd. Participation in voluntary service is the personification of individual responsibility. Thank you guys for what you do. 96 monuments in Antietam. There's only 5 Confederate monuments. The Texas Monument was in 1964. That's Miss Maryland. That's the director of the National Park Service, George Hartzog. It was dedicated on Veterans Day. Probably cold. I'm not sure why they did that date. And our last presidential visitor, Jimmy Carter. That's the last. So we've had 8 presidents visit Antietam Battlefield. I don't have photographs of all 8, but we had 8 presidents visit the battlefield. 3 of the 8 have been assassinated. Not a very good odds. It's probably why we hadn't had any since. Okay, a little change of pace here. I'm going to show you the history of this park in 5 maps because this is what you need to understand about Antietam Battlefield. That is your national park in 1933 when it was transferred. the green is the national park. And what this was, National Cemetery, they bought a little piece down here for a couple monuments. That's the New York plot for the New York Monument, and that's Philadelphia Brigade Park. And then the rest of it, it's kind of hard to see, but there's green for the road network. So at the time, it was 65 acres. That's your national park in 1933. Up until 1959, most of the effort was try to protect Burnside Bridge. Then in the 60s, like I said, a glory time for the national park. All the National Battlefield parks, you can see a lot of property was bought. The Moomaw Farm, Piper Farm, Otto Farm. You really filled out kind of the core of the battlefield. But the thing that's important here is, remember our legislation, no more than 600 acres. That did it, 600 acres. There's two ways to protect land. You can buy it outright, owning it in fee simple, or you can do what's called a scenic easement. And that happens here and in other national battlefields, where you buy the rights to the property, not full ownership. People could even still live there. We use that. And so what's going to happen in Antietam is, and we can see it here graphically, is that, okay, we reached 600, we can't buy any more land. So for the 70s, yellow is scenic easement. Also notice on your chart, blue is we bought it, ownership, red, scenic easements. So you can see the ownership, the buying is way down, scenic easements way up during the 1970s. Same thing in the 1980s, a lot more scenic easements. You see a lot more yellow, you see a lot more red on this chart about scenic easements. 1988, crucial date in the history of Antietam National Battlefield. A rider was gotten through Congress that the battlefield could expand to its full legislative boundary, which is 3,200 acres. And here's the result. Since 1990, a lot more green. 60% of Antietam National Battlefield has been purchased since 1990. 60% of the park's been bought since the last 25 years. And here's the great irony. This is the part that is really something. We never had that great champion. We never became a full national military park. We did not become Gettysburg. We didn't buy all this land. But the result of that is it didn't grow up around the park because there was no great 3,000 acre battlefield to draw all that in. We get 300,000 people a year. What do you get here? 1.5 million, I think is about the number, right? Okay, so you had all the growth around the park. That didn't happen in Sharpsburg because we never owned any land. I mean, look at the irony. We didn't buy the land and it actually ended up being more preserved. But thank goodness we bought all those easements in the 70s and 80s because now those properties are preserved and they're being purchased and you got a lot of green. Every national park in the system has what's called a foundation document. This is who and what we are. This is our foundation document. The purpose of Antietam Battlefield is preserve, protect, interpret, and improve for the benefit of the public the resources associated with the Battle of Antietam and its legacy. And for most of the national battlefield parks, we're into that legacy piece now, which is what this program is a little bit of a piece of, is that legacy. You know, we've made it through all of our 150ths, now we're moving more into the legacy. Just for the folks that have been down to the park an awful lot, a couple great things have happened in the last 6 months. The Civil War Trust has bought 3 pieces of land on the north end of the battlefield in the last 6 months. They bought the triangle right here. Maybe the most critical, I've been there 20-some years, this is the most critical piece of land that's been bought. I would argue there were more casualties on that field than there was in the famous cornfield, which is just north of that. All the fighting was south of the corn and on the edges of the corn, which is that triangle right there. They bought that piece right there and they bought that piece right there. For those of you that have visited Antietam, right there, there's a house and a barn, you know, postdates the American Civil War. The barn no longer exists. They tore it down. Even more important, for the vistas, for the landscape, for the understanding of what happened on September 17th, they tore out a major tree line that used to be right down through here. Today, for the first time in 100 and whatever years, you can look from the cornfield and see the Dunker Church. The exact same view that was there in 1862. Civil War Trust still owns that, but I imagine it'll be part of our national park pretty soon. Then right up here, this little triangle, there was a house there a month ago, came down in 2 days. That was a piece of what was called the North Woods. We're going to replant some of the North Woods in there. And that is really almost the gateway to the park on the north end. It's going to look exactly like it did in 1862, which is obviously our mission. So that's the latest news in the park on the positive side. Let's talk a little bit about one of our challenges, Burnside Bridge. I don't know if y'all been following this any, but a year ago, January, a big chunk of it just fell off into the creek. Come to work one day. You imagine? I come to work one day and they said, the Burnside Bridge just fell into the creek. I said, you got to be kidding me. There's all the stone. It just fell off. Freezing and thawing had gotten in there. Water had infiltrated the bridge. And one of the things I'm very proud of my organization, at the highest levels of the National Park Service and the Department of Interior, they said, "It's the Burnside Bridge. We got to fix it." I would argue it's the most famous Civil War structure in the country. Structure now, there's fields and landscapes and things, but as far as structures go, Fort Sumter, maybe, I don't know. Burnside Bridge, maybe the most important structure. We got to fix it. The money flowed. And it didn't flow in the normal way that money usually flows, where you got to do all these projects. The money came. What happened was, we had contractors. It's hard to see, but that's a dam. And it was 100 times worse than what we thought once we built that dam and got the water out of there. Look at that. That is the main pier of the Burnside Bridge. The engineer said if you didn't fix this thing, the whole thing would collapse in 10 years. It's all washed away under the water line. Nobody had been under that water line. The bridge was built in 1837 for $3,200. We're going to spend a little closer to $2 million to fix it. But look at that. It's just gone. So they've been working day or night. They built these forms, rebar. There's an entirely new pier now. They just finished the second pier. There's 2 piers that are out in the water. They're going to actually take the bridge down, rebuild it up. It'll be if you guys are going to visit next summer, the bridge will be closed all next summer. But this is too important. We got to get it done. So, if you came to the Antietam National Battlefield in the 1950s and 60s and you wanted to see the Dunker Church, that's what you saw. But thank goodness, through a lot of preservation efforts, it looks more like that today. But it's not just about the church. It's about all that land around it. It's about the property. 65 acres isn't enough. 600 acres isn't enough. Look what you had. Love the red trailer. But now, you visit today, looks like that. And here's the real reason. It's not just about preserving a nice building in the country. The real reason is so you can stand there and do that. And make that connection back to the sacrifices of 1862. And you can't do that anywhere except on a national battlefield park that is preserved. You can't get it from a book. You can't get it from a map. You've got to stand on the place that it happened and get the same view. Keep your eye on the church. That's 90 degrees to the north. That's the barn that was just taken down. That's the tree line that was just taken out. If you were there after the battle, that's what it looked like. That's the remnants of S.D. Lee. Just north of the Visitor Center, that's the Chief Ranger's house, or was the Chief Ranger's house in the 1960s up until the 70s. We kicked him out. And that's what you got. Along the Hagerstown Turnpike. So you stand there today, and you can step back to these Louisiana soldiers who died along that fence. Or you walk down Cornfield Avenue, you just look at these rocks. No big deal, right? That's just south of the cornfield on Cornfield Avenue. So if you went to Bloody Lane in the 1950s, as we've already seen, that's what it looked like. What I want you to do, pay attention to that monument right now as I go through the images. Oh, got a ooh there, that's good. You realize how much Photoshop that is? There's the battlefield in the 70s. There's the Visitor Center, that's Bloody Lane. Man, it doesn't look like anything like that today. And once again, here's the point. You stand at the sunken road. You see the sacrifices that took place there. It's just a little bit farther to the west, a little farther up the sunken road. Alexander Gardner arrived a couple days after the battle, spent 4 or 5 days. First battlefield in the country that was photographed before the dead were buried. We have a tremendous photographic history at Sharpsburg. So back in the 50s, there's the bridge. We already looked at that. There it is today. A little different. They built a bypass. There's a modern bridge up in those trees in 1964. Once again, the glory period in the 1960s, they built a bypass, get the cars off the bridge. So now you can stand there and step back in time. all those bodies were moved over to the National Cemetery. And that's why we do it. For the next generation, so that they never forget the sacrifice of those veterans, that every one of these presidents and every one of these people that came to these commemorations knew that was the future. Thank you all for your time and attention. Appreciate it.